surge of coronavirus infections is soaring, with more than 400,000 confirmed cases in a day. Meanwhile, as NPR's Lauren Freyer reports from Mumbai, a fire at a hospital in western India has left at least 18 people dead. TV footage of the hospital's front gate shows a blaze lighting up the pre-dawn sky. Survivors are rushed out on gurneys, burned. All of the victims were either COVID-19 patients or nurses caring for them. Prime Minister Narendra Modi tweeted his condolences. The fire was yet another tragedy on top of so many. India on Saturday confirmed more than 400,000 new coronavirus infections, another world record. Its hospitals are overwhelmed. Patients are dying in lines outside, waiting to get care. In theory, India has now opened up COVID vaccinations to anyone over 18, but several states have run out of supplies. The U.S. is now restricting travel from India and telling Americans to come home. Lauren Freyer, NPR News, Mumbai. The CDC is advising vaccine providers to be on the lookout for anxiety-related events after people get the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine. But as Sam Whitehead from member station WABE reports, the anxiety episodes happened before concerns were raised about rare but severe blood clots in some people who got the shot.
CDC researchers investigated incidents of dizziness, nausea, and fainting in dozens of people who received the J&J shot at 5 mass vaccination sites in early April. They say reports of fainting were 164 times more common after the J&J vaccine than after the flu vaccine. Researchers theorized that the one-dose shot could be more attractive to people with needle aversion, and the general stress of the pandemic might increase anxiety around vaccination. The CDC says providers should observe all vaccine recipients for 15 minutes after vaccination and be aware that anxiety events can occur that don't present serious medical risks. For NPR News, I'm Sam Whitehead in Atlanta.
Medina Spirit has won the 147th running of the Kentucky Derby, beating favorite Essential Quality, who was undefeated before this race. Kentucky Public Radio's Rylan Barton reports weather and track conditions were perfect.
With Medina Spirit's victory, legendary trainer Bob Baffert set a new record for most Kentucky Derby wins at 7. It was also the 4th Derby win for jockey John Velasquez, who won last year's Run for the Roses aboard Authentic, also trained by Baffert. More than 50,000 people poured into Churchill Downs to watch this year's race, one of the largest sporting event crowds of the pandemic. Still, that's about a third of the attendance expected in a typical Derby year. Last year, the race, annually run on the first Saturday in May, was delayed until September and held without spectators. For NPR News, I'm Rylan Barton in Louisville, Kentucky.
This is NPR.
We're going to go back now to India, which once again shattered the record for new coronavirus cases in a single day, reporting more than 400,000 new cases today. And the true numbers may be even higher because test kits are in short supply. So are hospital beds, medical oxygen, and antiviral drugs. The government there is rushing to try to get vaccines in people's arms, and today it opened up eligibility to anybody over 18 years old. NPR's Lauren Freyer is in Mumbai and is with us now. Lauren, thanks so much for joining us once again.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
As I think many people know by now, India is being pummeled by this new coronavirus wave. Today, all adults there are finally eligible for vaccination. Are there enough shots to go around?
No, frankly, not at all. Several states have closed their vaccination centers for lack of supply. Where I am here in Mumbai, all the vaccine centers are closed for 3 days. Everybody had their appointments canceled. And then this morning, 6 centers here opened up unexpectedly, and it set off this mad dash. People were running down to the hospital, the police were blocking this rush, and there's a sense of urgency because of these ghastly scenes that we're seeing play out across the country. Today, 18 COVID patients died in an overcrowded hospital that caught fire. Patients are dying still in parking lots of other hospitals. They're dying at home, unable to get care.
You know, Lauren, when we talked last week, you talked about some of these just truly desperate scenes, people calling the equivalent of 911, nobody answering. Since then, the U.S. and other countries have said that they're sending medical equipment and oxygen to India. Is there any sign of that? Do you see whether that's helping at all?
I mean, we are seeing huge packages land at Delhi's airport. It is a massive relief effort, but India has supply chain problems, and aid isn't always getting to the people who need it, or at least not quickly enough.
Well, how are people coping with this?
You know, you and I talked last week, and I said I thought it couldn't get worse. And I was wrong. Then I had only one friend who was ill and unable to get care and texting me, asking for help. Now I have 3 friends in this situation. And we're texting, but I fear that moment when I don't get the double check, the blue check, that they have seen my message, that they're still on the other end of the line. And in absence of a robust government response, people are helping one another, like via social media. I mean, there are tweets like, oh, this person needs an oxygen cylinder in this neighborhood, like who can work the phones for this person? These are strangers, and they're responding to one another in a lot of ways faster than the government.
Why wasn't the government more prepared, and are people thinking about that?
Yeah, there's real anger here, because until recently, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was paying more attention to local elections. He was holding these political rallies with thousands of people, rather than making sure that these hospitals had what they needed. And there's been a sense of exceptionalism here. Like there was something special about India, that it had avoided the worst of COVID, and people wanted to believe that, and the government wanted to believe that. Even now, with the government busy with this crisis, it's asking Twitter and Facebook to remove posts that are critical of Modi. I mean, India wants to see itself as a rising power. It does not want to become infamous as a country that was not able to save its own people.
Before I let you go, I just have to ask about medical personnel. I can't imagine what medical personnel there are going through, seeing people die before their eyes for want of supplies that are readily available elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, and now we know what it takes to beat this virus. It's not always possible, right? But we know the tools that we need. And so doctors are frustrated because they can't get that oxygen. They can't get those tools. And when I'm talking about this flood of videos and pleas on social media, these are coming from medical professionals too. I mean, I just saw a video of a doctor who came out of her hospital and sat in her car and cried, and on Facebook Live, like the strain on the medical staff here. You're seeing 5-10 times as many patients, but you have the same size staff there, and they are working nonstop to try to save their country.
That is NPR's India correspondent Lauren Frayer in Mumbai. Lauren, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thanks, Michelle.
When you hit play on NPR One, you'll hear the biggest national stories of the day, as well as stories and podcasts straight from your community. Did you know you can also listen to your local NPR station live here on NPR One? Just scroll down to the bottom of the home screen and look for the live radio section.
It's an issue that's been a political and emotional challenge for this country through multiple administrations and remains one. We're talking about immigration. President Biden called it our exhausting war over immigration in his first joint address to Congress earlier this week and urged Congress to act. That political fight has actually grown more intense in recent weeks as a record number of migrants has been arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border. This past March, the number of migrants encountered at the U.S.-Mexico border was actually the most in at least 15 years. Amid all this, President Biden has nominated Ed Gonzalez, sheriff of Harris County, Texas, which is home to Houston, to lead Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That agency, better known as ICE, hasn't had a permanent leader since 2017. So here to talk about what this nomination says about Biden's approach to immigration is Adam Isaacson from the Washington Office on Latin America. That's an advocacy organization that seeks to advance human rights in the Americas. And he has spent years focusing on immigration and security. Adam Isaacson, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Michelle.
As we mentioned, President Biden has nominated Harris County Sheriff Ed Gonzalez to lead ICE. Just your initial reaction to this?
I think it's a remarkably good choice, actually. In both the case of Customs and Border Protection, CBP, as well as ICE, just in the past couple of weeks, Biden has chosen 2 progressive sheriffs from border cities. You've got people with law enforcement experience, but also who have worked at times to confront CBP and ICE, the agencies they're leading, but not in an openly confrontational, camera-grabbing way.
So let me just help people catch up if they're not sure exactly what you're talking about, because the president announced another key nomination on border security. He's tapped the Tucson, Arizona Police Chief Chris Magnus to head Customs and Border Patrol. And I just think it's important to note that ICE and Customs and Border Patrol do have different leadership, but they're both housed within the Department of Homeland Security. So just sort of set the table for people who aren't as familiar with this as you are. How do their profiles compare to past ICE leadership? For example, the sheriff, a former sheriff as head of ICE. What's been the previous leadership profile?
For the most part, people who have run ICE before are people who came up in the agency or have more experience with immigration enforcement specifically. And of course, during the Trump administration, those were some very hardline people who opposed efforts at immigration reform. So to bring in somebody with a bit of outsider credentials, it could mean some cultural clash if he does indeed become the director of ICE.
Well, I do want to point that out, that it's worth mentioning that the former President Trump, has had the backing of major border patrol unions, which suggests that there may be people in the ranks who are aligned with the former president's views on immigration. And one of the things that you've written about quite a bit is the culture of these agencies. And I'm wondering whether you think these new nominees will face a confrontation with the culture of these agencies, or perhaps that once they become leaders, if they are confirmed, then the rank and file will follow their lead.
This is going to be a huge issue. As police chief Gonzalez didn't have, I wouldn't say run-ins, but he had strong disagreements with ICE under Trump over the policy of turning over people who they've arrested to ICE if they turned out to be undocumented. Like a lot of police chiefs, Gonzalez's posture was that this makes his job harder in a city with more than 400,000 undocumented people. You don't get the collaboration of the population that you need. So there already was some bad blood.
If Sheriff Gonzalez and former Chief Magnus have different missions now, why wouldn't they then bring themselves more in alignment with the agencies that they've now been asked to lead, as opposed to taking that sort of critical perspective?
The agencies that both have been asked to lead are agencies that are in need of some reform. They have terrible relationships with the communities they police. They have a reputation for just sort of everyday mistreatment of the populations they detain or interrogate. They both have low morale. So clearly the Biden administration does think it has a mandate or at least a duty to reform these agencies. So they didn't nominate somebody from within the existing culture to lead them. They nominated police chiefs who have some reputation for, again, not being crusaders, but for being reformists. People who did support more of a human rights and community relations approach as sheriffs. So unless these chiefs suddenly decide either to completely just blend in and stand down, which would be a break with their past career pattern, or unless they feel that any of their reform efforts are thwarted and they're not getting supported from the top, which also seems unlikely, then what we're probably going to see is chiefs who are probably carefully but still steadily and constantly finding themselves in conflict with some key mid-level leadership and maybe even the rank and file.
So before we let you go, President Biden has said that he wants to address the root causes of migration. Is this approach, in your view, the right one?
The way they're talking about it in the administration, I think, is correct. They're talking about acute causes, which are the immediate things that people don't have enough to eat. They're suffered the impact of storms. And then they talk about root causes like climate change, poverty, and of course just violence, gang violence that drives people out. And then underlying that is, why has Central America been so susceptible to poverty and violence over these years? And you get back to corruption and inequality and lack of accountability. So those three layers is what they plan to combat. Obviously, in 4 years, you're only going to be able to get to the surface, most acute causes, but perhaps they can set in motion at least the foundations of an approach to make Central America a place that people are less likely to want to flee.
That was Adam Isaacson. He is the Director for Defense Oversight at the Washington Office on Latin America. Adam Isaacson, thanks so much for your time.
Hey, thank you for having me.
If a child goes into foster care, that means their family is most likely in crisis. Maybe the child's been neglected or even abused. These are some of the most vulnerable of children. So imagine if the state then gave that child a bill, told them to pay for their own foster care. An NPR investigation with the news organization The Marshall Project finds that states do just that. NPR investigative correspondent Joseph Shapiro explains.
Alex Carter had been in foster care since he was a child. Some years ago, she found out that Social Security was sending her a disability check, more than $700 a month. It's money for people with disabilities like her to pay for basic needs, like food, clothing, and shelter. But Carter didn't get the money. The state of Alaska took it as a payment for the foster care the state provided. To Alex Carter, she was just turning 20 when I met her. That seemed unfair.
Go ahead and let me just pay for being taken away from my parents.
In effect, she, a child.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Westcom Credit Union. Westcom is a not-for-profit financial cooperative owned by their members, and deposits are insured by NCUA. Learn more at westcom.org.
A few years ago, a website popped up in Stockton, California, and conspiracy theories started ramping way up.
It's being funded by conservative movement underneath the table. I was like, oh my gosh, you guys.
Today, it seems like everybody's got a bone to pick with the news. So what happens when somebody stops talking smack and just decides to wage all-out war?
First thing you do in an invasion, you eliminate the communications of the enemy.
And what happens if they win?
It's an endless hole of just innuendo and doubt.
This is a weapon. Oh my gosh, you guys, people really believe this. They wanted to be kingmakers.
Tap your screen now to visit Stockton, California with NPR's Invisibilia for a story about a revolt against the mainstream media that's shaken up the city.
It's Friday, April 30th. I'm Austin Cross with the afternoon edition of the LA Report from KPCC and LAist. Here's what we're watching this afternoon. The large coronavirus vaccination site at Dodger Stadium is set to close at the end of May. The city-run site was one of the largest in the country and has already distributed more than 400,000 vaccines. The announcement comes as demand for the shot has slowed down, causing some concern for health officials. County Public Health Director Barbara Ferrer said this week vaccine sites countywide are actually seeing a 50% drop in people showing up for their first dose. Dr. Shruti Gohil, professor of medicine at UC Irvine School of Medicine, says some people may get the wrong idea as the state moves forward with reopening.
As we start opening up, the signal symbolically also will be able to which is that, well, things are looking better now, and maybe I don't need that vaccine after all. And what I would say is, boy, we have again been brought to our knees for a year. Time to get vaccinated. There's no reason. Why wouldn't you hesitate?
Dr. Gohil says to remember, millions of people have gotten the vaccine without serious complications, and her patients who have been vaccinated express relief and excitement about being able to go outside and see their loved ones with a much lower fear of getting sick or spreading COVID-19. Personally, I hugged my mom for the first time in a year yesterday. Totally worth it. Meanwhile, it is now easier for older teenagers to get the COVID-19 shot. KPCC health reporter Jackie Fortier has more.
16 and 17-year-olds can now bring a consent form signed by their parent or guardian and get the COVID-19 vaccine at Los Angeles County-run sites. Before, the adult had to come in person. LA County health officials say it's still better if the parent or guardian can come, but the consent form allows flexibility for working parents. There are 41 school sites in LA County giving the COVID shots next week. 16 and 17-year-olds need the Pfizer vaccine because it's the only one approved for their age group. A parent or guardian just needs to print the form, fill it out, and send it with their teenager when they go to the clinic. LA County health officials say about a quarter of eligible teens have received their first shot, but as with adults, teens in lower income areas are getting the vaccine in smaller numbers. Covering health, I'm Jackie Fortier.
A referendum over whether to ban flavored tobacco in California just got a little bit more complicated. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration announced that it's working on banning menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars. The agency has already taken steps to curb flavored e-cigarettes. California lawmakers voted last year to ban most flavored tobacco products. But the industry gathered enough signatures to block the law and instead let voters decide on next year's general election ballot. Malia Cohen with the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids says the federal rule may not take effect for years, but the announcement bolsters the effort to ban flavored products.
Frankly, this announcement from the FDA and the Biden administration is long overdue. It's And I think what we're going to see is more momentum as we move forward into the future.
The campaign opposing a flavored tobacco ban in California declined an interview request. Tobacco companies argue the ban would disproportionately target communities of color and reduce state tax revenues by hundreds of millions of dollars. Californians who support a single-payer healthcare system say it's time for Governor Gavin Newsom to keep his campaign promise and take steps toward making it a reality. Cap Radio's Sammy Kaola checked in with advocates.
Just to recap, single-payer means that instead of having private health plans and public plans like Medicare and Medi-Cal, all health insurance would be paid for by the state government. A bill that could have created this system has been shelved and likely won't be considered again until 2022. On Monday, activists from Democratic Socialists of America gathered to push for single payer. Organizer Andy Sunderland says it's time for Newsom to champion the cause, which he campaigned on back in 2018.
So where is he on? When are we going to get it done? Gavin and our Democratic representatives need to answer for that to each one of us and everyone else who's living through a pandemic without health insurance.
The criticism from the left comes as Newsom faces a potential recall this fall. Sally Pipes is president of free market think tank Pacific Research Institute. She says a single-payer system would be costly, but she doesn't expect Newsom will take that fight on right now.
It didn't surprise me that it was shelved. I think nothing is going to happen until after we see where the recall goes.
A spokesperson from Newsom's office says he still supports single-payer and is exploring ways to move it forward. Proponents say Newsom should write to the Biden administration to request a federal waiver to shift to a new system. In Sacramento, I'm Sammy Kaola.
Thanks for listening to the LA Report. I'm Austin Cross. Join us next time for another LA Report.
This program is made possible in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
For some time now, activists seeking change around this country's criminal justice system have made police abuse a top priority. Increasingly, activists and office holders have pointed to police unions and their contracts as a major roadblock to those changes. A group in San Antonio called Fix SAPD is now trying to change that dynamic in their city. A ballot measure in today's citywide election would, if passed, repeal the union's collective bargaining rights. O.G. Martin co-founded Fix SAPD, and she is with us now to tell us more from San Antonio. O.G. Martin, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
I think I should mention that we do not believe that we are related, even though we have the same last name. So with that being said, this is a relatively new group started just this past year. Could you just tell us a little bit about how Fix SAPD got started? Like, what was the germ of the idea?
Yeah, so it started directly after the death of George Floyd. Like so many other Americans, sitting in my home, I was just watching the television screen, wondering how could this happen and what can we do about it. And it began with the kitchen table conversation with my brother that led to us doing more investigation on a Washington Post reporting that San Antonio was #1 in the nation for rehiring fired officers. And a deeper dive into it, we saw that there are some issues within our current police union contract that have resulted in that high percentage of rehired officers that have been fired previously by the chief. So we decided to talk to our neighbors, talk to our family and friends, and basically we're able to get people excited about this issue of fixing the accountability problems in San Antonio by repealing collective bargaining for police officers here in our city. That was really the only way that we could have impact on the contract itself.
And collective bargaining, for people who don't know, that means what? That just means that the union represents the employees and negotiates around issues like what? Overtime wages, disciplinary procedures, things of that sort?
Correct. So with collective bargaining, the police union here in San Antonio represents the police officers of San Antonio Police Department, and they are able to negotiate on benefits, wage, compensation, all that stuff. But something else that they are able to negotiate on is discipline. And for most people, right off the bat, if you ask them this, should accountability be negotiable? It is no. Accountability is non-negotiable. Great. Negotiate on your benefits, your pension, your health care. All that is fine. But when it comes to holding bad apple officers accountable for their actions, that is non-negotiable. And that is what we are trying to do here in San Antonio. Bring accountability to the forefront and make sure that it is something that we consider in any contract that is signed moving forward.
Can you give us an example of where you feel that the current contract was perpetuating negative behavior or has prevented someone who has committed wrongdoing from being held accountable?
So if listeners go to fixsapd.org, you will be able to find the 10 most egregious disciplinary barriers that are within the contract. They include arbitration, which means officers have the opportunity to overrule the chief's decision through an arbitration process, which we find out has led to 70% of officers getting their jobs back. Some other disciplinary issues within the contract include the 180-day rule, which is basically a statute of limitation for when the chief of police can reprimand an officer for an offense. And I'll give you an example of that. There was the infamous case of Matthew Luckhurst, who fed a homeless man, a man living on the street, offered him a feces sandwich, 2 pieces of bread with feces in between them, and gave it to this man.
Why?
I don't think anyone could tell you why he decided to do that act that day. However, as any reasonable chief of police or any reasonable employer would do, he was fired by the chief of police. But because of the barriers in this contract, he was able to, 1, seek arbitration, and 2, win his arbitration because of the 180-day rule, which basically stipulated that because the chief did not reprimand him in the allotted time, this individual should be allowed his job back. Even though the arbitrator sided with the chief, saying, yes, that was the right thing to do. However, my hands are tied. The law says this officer needs to be given his job back. And not only given his job back, but he's given his job back with back pay, because this arbitration took almost a year to complete.
You know what's interesting though is that Texas is a right to work state, but progressives in recent years have been trying to get more workers covered by collective bargaining rights, not fewer. I mean, people will remember that, the big push just in the last month to try to get an Amazon warehouse. This is obviously a private employer, but you get them unionized.
Right.
In recent years, I mean, that's what's so interesting about this is that you're going in the opposite direction here, and I'm just wondering if you've thought about that and how do you square that?
Yes, so I have thought about that because myself personally, I do believe in workers' rights. I do believe in the usefulness and purposefulness of unions. They've been so instrumental in making sure that workers get the things that they need for safety as well as compensation. And that is so important to me. However, when a union hurts individuals with their ability to collectively bargain, when they take that privilege and use it instead of for good, but rather to protect and create some kind of insulation for bad apple officers, I see this no longer as a workers' rights issue, but a human rights issue. That is how I square it. We do not want officers on our streets that feed men living on the streets feces sandwiches. We do not want officers that have been fired, not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, but in the case of Lee Rankin, he was fired 6 times by the chief of police for a list of disorderly conduct, including using racial slurs against a Mexican-American lieutenant. So when we have a collective bargaining structure that facilitates such egregious offenses and facilitates a means for bad apples to be left unaccountable for their actions, We are no longer talking about workers' rights and are now talking about human rights.
That was O.G. Martin. She is one of the co-founders of Fix SAPD. O.G. Martin, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
During his last months in office, former President Trump ordered federal agencies to stop racial